Hello, SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be part one in a short series related to recent uploads, recent series, but ancient alchemy, legends of miners and metalworkers, and how esoteric symbolism in art, in architecture, ancient legends and ancient depictions contain some very interesting information. Now, especially in regards to alchemy, which one aspect of that was the ancient creation of metals, jewelry, weapons, etc. So in this one I want to be focusing on these ancient, so we have Ptah here, two variations of him, and we also have Hephaestus or Vulcan. Now you'll notice he is lame. Ptah is, or Pataikos is shown in dwarven form, but he is also shown in green skin. These are some of the ancient gods of metalworking, and there's some lovely information in regards to what's happening here. So if we look more to the classic Hermetic period, so for instance here on the left we have the Temple of Music by Robert Fludd, famous, very important alchemist, and the two images in the center and on the right are by Athanasius Kircher, very influential, very important as well, and they contain, again, layers of information which can be blended back through older legends, science, to show quite some interesting connections. So what links these images, where I've now if we see them closer, we notice four figures all hammering. They're engaged in metalwork. We see the same four figures here engaged in metalwork with their hammers. And here we see similar, but here in this case we see mining. Now I could also mention the beehive cave, which is seen here, which is a symbol of industry, so bees being very industrious. Now this is, in Masonic tradition, lodges used to be called beehives as well, but also just the generic esoteric symbol of the beehive as in industry. But what we have is metalworking and mining, which just go hand in hand, which will link us to, this will be a more obvious image. So we have Vulcan, as in volcanoes and fire, the god of fire, and he was known as Hephaestus in Greek. He's the god of fire, he's the god of metalworking, assisted by the Cyclops, and here we see four of them at the anvil hammering with their metal. Here's an image by Cornelius Cort, 1572. Again, Hephaestus. Now you'll often have Phrygian cap, but again we see the Cyclops, and they at work. Now it's also interesting, this is from the 16th century, so now we see cannons. Now that's an interesting connection as well, because the casting cannons, you want to be very, very accurate with your cannons. Were notoriously dangerous and could be more dangerous to their operators than to the people where you were pointing them at. And it was the bell casters who had a particular skill, because they had to tune their bells. If you don't cast your bell properly, it does not make for a very nice bell. So the connections between metalworking, alchemy, and music is a strong one. So bell casting, they were the original casters of cannons. And bronze cannons and bronze bells, this will be an important feature in this particular series of video. Bronze and how that relates to these ancient legends, imagery, but also the ancient sciences in regard especially to metalworking. And what is bronze? Bronze is a copper alloy. Bronze is not a metal in the stricter sense. It's an alloy of copper, usually with tin, most people know, but with bismuth or arsenic is another way to make bronze. Here we see in 1492 Pythagorean music. So we see with the strings, with the pipes. Now, if I can get that in, you also maybe these sets of numbers, 4, 6, 8, 9, 12, 16, how they relate. Now you'll see that the numbers are written there, and they're also written on these glasses filled with water, but the bells. So Pythagorean music, Pythagorean tuning, which is at the core of these famous Hermeticists, and again going back to at least 2,000 years, I'm of the opinion, and that based on the architecture prior to Pythagoras, that this was Even the Greeks themselves tell us they learnt from the Babylonians and Egyptians. So, but in rock solid certainty, this does, at least to that Hellenistic period, but more likely much longer. So again, the bells and being able to tune the bell. So not just making a bell properly, but also making them at the right weight and size so that they're tuned properly. So in regards to what's referred to as Pythagorean harmonic tuning. But you'll also notice here these metal workers are you've got the tongs, and they're hammering the metal. Pythagorean tuning, as the legend goes, developed from something called the Pythagorean hammers, when Pythagoras was passing a blacksmith shop and he noticed that the hammers were perfectly tuned with one another, and he ran in to see what was happening, and he noticed that the hammers were out of different weights, and this led to them being in tune with one another. That's Pythagorean hammers, but the bells as well could be the same. So this importance of music, connection to the quadrivium, so music, astronomy, geometry and arithmetic. In the past these were linked. That's the quadrivium, the four higher of the seven liberal arts. Now in Kircher's imagery, or Fludd, or just pick one and you'll find the same connection where there's multiple levels. So for instance, Robert Fludd, Temple of Music, and this image by Kircher. Now what we have is music. Now there's also some music there, but it's not clearly music. And there we see the musical instruments. And like this image by Fludd, it's literally called the Temple of Music. It's overloaded with musical images, including Apollo. Notice the sun rays of the sun god Apollo carrying the lyre, or lyre depending, and of course the lute there at the bottom. But he also has those four metal workers at the forge, just like partly obscured there, just like Kircher does as well. Also enlarge this figure, we notice the lyre of Apollo and the 3, 4, 5 triangle. So Pythagoras, the lyre, the 3, 4, 5 triangle, geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, imagery in there as well. But in regards to tuning, we also have this very sacred ancient symbol called the tetractys, which is essentially the same as the tetragrammaton in Kabbalist Judeo-Christian traditions. Pythagorean tuning, which would relate to the 3-4-3 or 3-4 ratio. But so Pythagorean hammers scaled at a 4-3, 3-2 ratio, as well as the tetractys. We see the 4, 3, 2 and 1, 2-1 being an octave, and how these the music of the blacksmiths, and in regards to hammers, and there we see the tetractys, just enlarged it here. So this connection between geometry, music, astronomy and arithmetic is a very strong one, a very old one. Classic image of the blacksmiths at their trade. Hephaestus, Vulcan with the Cyclops, and also an older image from Greece again. So metalworking, mining, music, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, these are all linked together. But in that particular image by Kircher, we also, if we close up, we see the Alchemist's lab. So again, alchemy with the quadrivium very strongly linked. Here's an older image of Artemis again. So there we see Artemis, or Diana, the goddess of the moon. And here we can see all the instruments, the furnace, but also distillation and the mortar and pestle and other very important instruments of the chemist's trade. Still now, it's still very important. And this is in Stephan Michelspacher, where we see the tincture, coagulation, distillation, putrefaction, solution, sublimation, calcination. These are chemical operations. And we also have these 7 gods. So Saturn with the scythe, Jupiter, the thunderbolt of Zeus, also the moon goddess, Diana Artemis with the crescent, the sun god, there we see Ares or Mars, god of war, and there we have Venus, and as always at the top we have Mercury, or Hermes, with his caduceus. So I can just, where we get a closer up of them, but each one of these also relates to an important metal: lead, tin, copper, gold, silver, iron, and of course the element mercury, which is a prima materia, mercury amalgams for instance. But so Apollo, the sun god, gold sun; Artemis, the moon goddess, silvery moon; and Mercury, the mercurial element. But the important one will be Aphrodite, or Venus, who is, her symbol represents copper. Hephaestus, or Vulcan, god of fire, metalworking, was married in not a too happy marriage with Aphrodite, or Venus, who represents copper. I'll do that, even notice the Aegis shield again, but Hephaestus and the Forge is another Wenceslas Holler image, but again the Cyclops, and with Hephaestus, lame Hephaestus, and that will be the elements here. But the Cyclops, the Aegis shield, partially obscured there, the bow and arrow of Artemis and Apollo, and the lightning bolt of Zeus / Jupiter. So that Cyclops image and these related images will also be seen in modern esoteric buildings. I've done some videos on these. Frank Albo, the Manitoba Legislative Building in Winnipeg, is something of a hotspot in regards to this esoteric architecture, symbolism, metrology, just written in stone as it is. Now on the dome at the top you have 4 corners. They're called industry, agriculture, science and art, but they alternatively represent water, air, earth and fire. So if you look, Michelspacher, ignis, fire; aeris, air; terra, earth; and aqua, water. Here in Sydney, the Captain Arthur Phillip fountain, again with the 4 corners, and so we have commerce, represented by Mercury, represents air; Neptune / Poseidon, obvious reference to water; agriculture, or Demeter / Ceres, earth. We also have the Cyclops, who is fire or industry. So there we see the Cyclops. You can see his hammer, and he's holding a piece of ore. Cyclops image. Now this photo is not, it's hard to get, but you have to, it's ever so slight, but what we have is a bulge in the center of his head representing that eye of the Cyclops, while in Manitoba it's more obscured, where we again the hammer, the anvil, but he's got a headscarf on. But these gods of metalworking, fire and industry in architecture, which brings us to Hephaestus, the god of metal; Vulcan, the god of fire and metalworking, as in volcano. So back to this Wenceslas Holler image, which is an important one, because again, as we saw, we have the bow and arrow of Artemis and Apollo, the sun and the moon gods; the Aegis shield of Athena, which relates to the cornucopia and the constellation Capella. Of course, we see the Cyclops, and they are at work making the thunderbolt of Zeus. But the important part about this image is what we see here, and that is the lame Hephaestus. He is not walking straight. So here's a more classic image of Hephaestus. Again, notice he is lame, his feet are twisted. Lame metalworking gods again. It's a bit of a close-up. Here's an old carving of Vulcan, the Roman name for Hephaestus, god of fire and metalworking. Even has the tongs and the hammer, the classic image of the metalworker. But notice how he stands on this box. Again, he is also depicted as lame. So just to center it. So gods of metalworking, commonly depicted as being lame, short in one leg. This in itself carries some very interesting information. Hephaestus or Vulcan, being both in ancient times and up until the classical recent Hermetic period of round about the Renaissance, in that chunky period there. These gods being depicted as lame, connection with metalworking. This is not exclusive to Greece and Rome, as we'll see. Now, for instance, in Norse traditions, Scandinavian, the metal gods would usually be worshipped as some, like a plaque would be made of these. Here is an example. And these metalworking gods, such as Weyland or Weyland the Smithy, as he's called, or Weylander or Ilmarinen from Finnish tradition, you'll notice that they too are being depicted as lame and also referenced in the surviving sagas, for instance. While here in Sydney, at the Sydney Masonic Centre, which is a statue of Tubal Cain, the primary figure in regards to metalworking. I'll also link this video in the description where he talks about the legend of Hiram Abiff and Tubal Cain and how they apply to Masonic legend, but this is biblical in basis. Tubal Cain, for instance, in Genesis, I think it's Genesis 4. We're talking about Cain and these early, just leading up to, just before the Noah comes in the flood, but Zillah bore Tubal Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. Depending on which version, you'll get bronze, but you could insert copper, many references to copper, but also Tubal Cain's brother created music, played the lyre and the pipe, and his sister was Nama was the creator of textiles. So they're like the industry references again. It sort of also relate to the Quadrivium. But Tubal Cain, very important figure. So I'll put this in the link. But so after the death of Cain, there are varying versions of it. But then, by some accounts, Tubal Cain was accidentally killed by his father, though some Jewish writers adopt the tradition that Tubal Cain did not die, but was severely injured by his father. According to some, he was lamed. Metalworking god being lamed again. Ancient blacksmiths, ancient alchemists, the ancient craftsmen. Now it's again bronze, but what is bronze? Bronze is a copper alloy of tin, arsenic or bismuth, and in the next episodes I'll go more into the specifics of that and why that's important. But whether it's Tubal Cain, Hephaestus, Vulcan, Weyland, Ilmarinen, these lamed gods in regards to metalworking. So let's have a look at what Herodotus says, and for instance during his visit to Egypt, similar would be happening with other writers such as Strabo. Hephaestus in Greek is Ptah in Egypt, the god of fire, a god of metalworkers, of craftsmen, and Ptah was the god of craftsmen, connected to construction and architecture as well, but the high priest of Ptah was the chief controller of the craftsmen. The tomb of Nefer has a very interesting image in regards to ancient alchemy, chemistry, but not for the moment. So, craftsmen. Now, Ptah is also depicted with green skin. This will be an important connection too. But for instance, when Herodotus or Strabo, these Greek Roman writers, visit Egypt, they call it by the equivalent of their name. So when he visits the temple of Ptah at Memphis, Memphis being a major center of cult center for Ptah, he calls it the noteworthy temple of Hephaestus. So whether it's, the Greeks, Romans will call it in their god's name, not in the original. So temple of Hephaestus is the temple of Ptah. In Book 3, he speaks about Cambyses as well, who was, went around destroying a lot of things, basically just destroyed Heliopolis, but the madness of Cambyses, and how does that connect with Hephaestus? So Cambyses, he entered the temple of Hephaestus and made much mockery of the image there. The image of Hephaestus is most like to the Phoenician Pataikos. I will describe for him who has not seen these figures, it is the likeness of a dwarf. So he's comparing it to a Phoenician god. Now Pataikos would be often placed on the boats of the Phoenicians. So he's not saying it is Pataikos, he's saying for those who have not seen the figures, it is the likeness of a dwarf. Which brings us to these Egyptian images such as this, which they refer to as Pataikos. The likeness and image of a dwarf. There are countless examples of these. Now, it's not, for instance, you can see the proportions of the legs and the hands and the size of a skull. They're depicting a dwarf. Now, there are many other images such as these, again with Pataikos, again where you can see the dwarven proportions and the shape of the body and even the top of the skull there. Now that braid, which is not of Harpocrates, I think I now forget exactly, but young Horus as well will often be depicted there, and there we see Bes, again another Egyptian dwarven god who was a protector of households and of youth, but young Horus also standing on crocodiles. This is a classic Hermetic image as well. Well, we've got actually quite a bit going on, but even the North Star there. So again, we see but that's something not quite necessary for the moment. But again, these dwarven images, and this being depicted in Egypt, where the dwarf god Ptah, who is the god of craftsmen, being shown in that sense. And so we have also Brokkr or Brokkr, whose name Norse legend again, for one who works with metal fragments, and this connection with mining, metalworking. We already saw lameness, but also a repeated connection across much of the ancient world is this connection with dwarves. For instance, in the Lord of the Rings movie, the dwarves were the masters of stonework. Also, they loved metals and gems and gold, etc. Above all, skilled miners and skilled metal workers, as well as stone carvers. The 7 dwarves, Snow White, their profession is mining. And even the Phrygian cap is a nice little connection, carry on. So Tolkien, he based both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are strongly drawn from Nordic stories and sagas such as Beowulf. For instance, in the latter part of the Beowulf saga, he must battle a dragon after a thief steals from the dragon hoard and disturbs it, and then the dragon goes on a rampage, just like in the Hobbit, where he attacks and starts burning everything down. And you can see in the Hobbit, for instance, they even call Bilbo Baggins is the thief, and even the dragon, when Bilbo's in, he disturbs the dragon's hoard. This awakes the dragon and sets him into a rage. You have nice manners for a thief and a liar. So again, that's drawn very strongly from Beowulf. However, Beowulf, his mail shirt was made by Weyland the smithy, which is often depicted with the lame aspect to his foot as well. And this is from Frank's casket in Northumbria. And again, the written accounts and the passed on traditions. But there we see with his tongs at the forge and the hammer, and he's held as slave by a king before he escapes by making some wings, but he's hamstrung by the king. So he's had his Achilles tendon cut, so he's not able to walk. And this is another aspect we'll get into, because this connects strongly to those other connections in regards to the lame gods of metalworking, such as Hephaestus. The Lord of the Rings, well, the One Ring concept from there is very similar to the Sampo, as it's called, a part of his Finnish legend. It was a magical item forged by the blacksmith Ilmarinen, who also is often said to have a limp. So his modern statue commemorating him in Helsinki is an older image, so he's making the Sampo is not, whether it was a cup or a ring, not exactly sure, but it's very, very close to the one ring in Lord of the Rings ultimately needs to be destroyed. So we have lame gods of metalworking, we have dwarven gods of metalworking, and we have green skin gods of metalworking. This could also apply to Osiris or to Inanna, both of them having to travel into the underworld, the place where mining is done as well. But I'll just be focusing on Ptah. But again, these green skin connections. Dwarves in Egypt, the lame gods of the Greco-Roman world, such as Vulcan and Hephaestus. Lame and dwarven metalworking gods in the Nordic countries, and how this relates to the ancient alchemical craft, especially metalworking, but also how applying different minerals, elements to metal, was a very important part of a trade and written into this architecture and this art and these ancient stories, and more and more coming to the fore as people examine these in a, rather than just you know, oh, alchemy, it's a pseudoscience, don't pay attention to it. Well, again, they were creating wonderful art, metalwork. This early modern chemistry still believed in pardon me, phlogiston theory, so you've got to be careful when you discredit older stuff and then not pay attention to the history of your modern elements. Okay, that'll be for the next part. We'll look at that in more in detail and start drawing stronger connections, stronger lines, looking at the science aspects of it and recent studies and examples of it. SGD, thank you very much. Part 2 will be out very, very soon. Hope you enjoyed. Have a good one, and cheers.